Chapter 6: A financially sustainable system delivering improved outcomes. The new single national send and alternative provision system should deliver consistent, clear and early support for children and young people with SEND and provide financial sustainability. The system should enable local partners to work together effectively with families to deliver for children and young people. Each partner should be accountable for playing their part, restoring young people and families' faith in the support they receive. Alongside record investment in high needs, these reforms should mean more resources are dedicated to providing timely, effective support early, and as a matter of course in mainstream settings. This should reduce the burden on parents to have to navigate the lengthy statutory EHC assessment process to receive support. Through the Change programme, we will build momentum towards this fairer and financially sustainable national send and alternative provision system that identifies clear standards for the provision and processes that should be in place for all children and young people, no matter what their need or where they live. This will help design and test these policies to ensure they work and do not create any unintended consequences for families. Meanwhile, we are supporting all local authorities to look at what positive action can be taken now to deliver high quality services, while bringing high needs budgets under control, so that local areas are in the best position to deliver the wider SEND system reform. These reforms will be a significant change to the high needs system and will require reforms to funding arrangements to support their delivery. For example, by ensuring that funding allows providers to deliver the expectations set out in the national standards efficiently. Clear and transparent processes which strike the right balance between national consistency and individual need will ensure a fairer and clearer system that takes all voices into account, especially those of children, young people and their families. Ensuring an appropriate supply of specialist provision will make sure that high quality specialist settings are available to those that require them. To create a fair and financially sustainable system, 1. We will increase core school funding by £3.5 billion in 2023 to 2024 compared to the year before, of which almost £1 billion of that increase will go towards high needs. This means high needs funding will be £10.1 billion in 2023 to 2024. 2. We will support local authorities through the Delivering Better Value and the Safety Valve programmes, and share the best practice from local areas with inclusive and sustainable high needs provision more widely. 3. We will develop a system of funding bands and tariffs so that consistent national standards are backed by more consistent funding across the country. 4. We will publish a response to the consultation on the school's national funding formula in 2023. Which includes proposals on funding for SEND, including the notional SEND budget, and a mechanism for transferring funding to high needs budgets. 5. We will develop new approaches to funding alternative provision aligned to their focus on preventative work with and reintegration of pupils into mainstream schools. We will do this in consultation with mainstream schools, the alternative provision sector, and local authorities. 6. We will re-examine the state's relationship with independent special schools to ensure we set comparable expectations for all state-funded specialist providers. 7. Fairer, sustainable funding. Supporting local authorities. We are supporting all local authorities to look now at what positive action can be taken to improve the way children and young people's needs are met, prepare for wider SEND system reform, bring high needs costs under control, and address DSG deficits. This includes the additional funding following the 2022 Autumn Statement. High needs funding will be rising to £10.1 billion in 2023 to 2024, an increase of over 50% from the 2019 to 2020 allocations. Despite this level of funding and the best efforts of local authorities, there continues to be a significant proportion of local authorities with accumulated DSG deficits, with the total deficits increasing to over £1 billion by the end of 2020 to 2021. The DSG statutory override has been extended for a one-off period of 3 years, up to March 2026. To allow local authorities the short-term flexibility needed to implement sustainable change. It is critical that, during this extension, local authorities continue to work with all parts of the SEND system to put themselves in the best position so that when the statutory override comes to an end, local authorities are able to demonstrate their ability to deal with remaining DSG deficits. In view of this, we have already begun supporting local authorities facing particular challenges in delivering their high needs system for children and young people sustainably. More than half of local authorities have been invited to join either the Safety Valve programme or the Delivering Better Value programme. The Safety Valve Programme, introduced in 2020 to 2021, for those local authorities with the very highest percentage DSG deficits, requires these local authorities to develop substantial plans for reform to their high-needs systems. With support and challenge from the Department for Education's SEND and financial experts, authorities produce plans to rapidly place their system on a sustainable footing by running it more effectively. Working collaboratively with key partners and families to do so. The Safety Valve Programme has demonstrated that, if a local area's leadership work together, it is possible for even those areas facing the most acute challenges to create innovative and viable plans to reach a sustainable position. And maintain a focus on high quality provision for children and young people with SEND. Steps they have taken to do this include developing a stronger mainstream offer, improving support for phase transitions, and ensuring sufficient local places to meet needs. As part of the programme, we expect local authorities' chief executives, chief finance officers, and directors of children's services to work together on the development of plans. These plans must also include listening to the experiences of children and young people and their families. And local authorities must have the support and engagement of local leaders, schools, parent and carer forums, and other key stakeholders. The principles of all safety valve agreements reflect the need to reach sustainability through genuine collaboration with partners. To ensure children and young people's needs are met early and appropriately. In 2022, we introduced the Delivering Better Value in SEND programme to target the 55 local authorities who have the next highest percentage DSG deficits after those in the Safety Valve programme. The programme takes a diagnostic approach to helping local authorities identify achievable and sustainable changes, that can drive high quality outcomes for children and young people with SEND, and equip authorities with the tools to enable them to maintain these changes sustainably on an ongoing basis. The objective of the diagnostic is, through robust evidence gathering and wider system engagement, to support authorities to identify the most impactful changes that can be made to improve outcomes for children and young people with SEND. Since the programme started, 20 local authorities have completed the diagnostic, with inputs from over 1,800 parents and carers, 500 education providers and professionals, and 700 practitioners across the 20 local systems. The work so far demonstrates that achievable opportunities exist to improve parent, carer, and child experiences. while managing spend more effectively across the SEND system. We will share learning, insights and best practice from the programme as it progresses. We are seeing that local authorities are able to refocus their resources and provision. To encourage mainstream schools to be more inclusive, ensure needs are met early and appropriately, and use available local provision effectively. We have published a research report and accompanying guidance to assist local authorities as they make plans for sustainability. Drawing on existing good practice in the sector and learning from the programmes. The research report shares over 60 case study examples of positive practice found in local authorities. And offers advice and recommendations that can be applied in other local areas. The initial experience from the safety valve and delivering better value programmes, along with this research, has demonstrated that some local authorities can and should be doing more to manage their systems well and sustainably. By supporting all local authorities to act now to adopt practices which support children and young people effectively and sustainably, we can put the system in the best position in advance of our wider reforms. Bans and tariffs. The Green Paper acknowledged that to improve financial stability in the system, we must make the most effective use of high needs funding. So that local authorities can use the record levels of investment to deliver quality support for children and young people with SEND. And balance their high needs budgets. We will introduce a national framework of banding and price tariffs. To support commissioners and providers to meet the expectations set out in the national standards. Whilst there will always be some local variation, to have a consistent national SEND and alternative provision system and ensure value for money, we must move to a world where similar types of support are backed by similar levels of funding. Bandings will cluster specific types of education provision, and tariffs will set the rules and prices that commissioners use to pay providers to deliver what is set out within the national standards. This will be implemented alongside our broader changes to the national funding system and the development of national standards. This will ensure that money is targeted to where it is needed most, and incentivise and equip settings to provide high quality education provision, thereby improving outcomes of those with SEND. Many stakeholders have welcomed the proposal for a more nationally consistent and transparent system. Some stated that a national framework will improve consistency and reduce the administrative burden on settings that accept pupils and students from multiple local authorities, such as colleges. While others welcome more transparency from providers to show how budgets are spent. Many respondents also expressed the importance of ensuring that funding and spending are designed to meet children and young people's needs. So that national consistency does not undermine supporting individual needs. This was echoed by stakeholders who noted that children and young people's needs change over time. And those with the most complex needs may not fit into neat categories or descriptors. Similarly, some said that a national approach should not cut across personalised individual decision making. Some stakeholders agreed that needs should drive provision and that any nationalised approach should only help inform funding. We also heard that a degree of flexibility at a geographical level was necessary to be able to respond to different financial landscapes. Most local authorities already make use of banded funding arrangements based on local levels of available provision and costs. We know that an effective funding system is one that is consistent, but is also flexible, transparent, and simple. The introduction of a national bands and tariffs funding system that sets expectations for the cost and delivery of provision, with appropriate flexibility, is dependent on other policy proposals, particularly the development of national standards, so this will be developed alongside them. It will be designed to appropriately reflect the needs of children and young people, including the most complex needs, and to meet the cost of the provision that they need. It will give providers clarity on how much funding they should expect to receive in delivering support or a service, and enable commissions to determine the funding required. We know that currently there is significant variation in the cost of provision across the country. So, starting in 2023, we will undertake research to gather more information about the cost of provision, and then explore the best way to manage and reduce this variation as much as possible. To do this, we will 1. Work with commissioners and providers to collect and analyse data on the cost of provision. 2. Which will then be used to inform the development of the bands, tariffs and funding structures needed to deliver the support set out in the national standards. 2. Consider how this research data can be shared with local authorities and providers to inform local decisions on commissioning and funding. We will look at how we can support local authorities by sharing this data to help inform their spending decisions. This will help to address some of the current inconsistencies in spending on high needs, in advance of the implementation of national standards and the accompanying tariffs. To further support fairer, sustainable funding, we will continue to work with independent specialist providers to consider how we can ensure that there is clarity and transparency about the cost of bespoke packages of support for children and young people with the most complex needs. Standardisation of notional SEND budgets. It is important that mainstream schools are resourced appropriately for making suitable provision for their pupils with SEND. In August, we published guidance on the notional SEND budget for mainstream schools that sought to clarify what the current notional SEND budget is for. And how local authorities should review the calculation of that budget through local funding formula factors. We are progressing towards fully implementing the National Funding Formula, or NFF, for mainstream schools. We consulted in summer 2022 on moving to a direct NFF, whereby all mainstream schools are directly funded via the NFF. Rather than through 150 local school funding formulae. As part of this, we consulted on whether the direct NFF would identify an indicative SEND budget for schools. Most responses to the consultation, including the majority of responses from local authorities and schools, indicated support for the direct NFF to include the identification of an indicative SEND budget determined by the Department for Education. We will publish more details on the outcome of this consultation in spring 2023. In moving towards the implementation of the direct NFF for mainstream schools, we will be looking carefully at what the national standards say about the SEND provision that schools should make available. This important first step will inform the level of funding that schools will need within their total budget. To deliver the expected type and level of provision for their pupils with SEND. We can then work out how best to design the calculation of the indicative SEND budget for each school. Funding stability for alternative provision. Alternative provision schools face a unique difficulty in accurately predicting pupil numbers. The link between funding and pupil numbers also presents a potential perverse incentive to admit and keep pupils. When they could receive interventions in or return to mainstream provision. Given these issues, the Green Paper proposed to ensure that state-funded alternative provision schools where the local authority maintained pupil referral units or alternative provision academies or free schools, have the funding security and stability they need to deliver a support service focused on early intervention. Under this proposal, local partnerships will draw up a plan for delivering alternative provision in their area. And identify the budget that would be needed to implement the plan over a minimum period of 3 years. This proposal was welcomed across the sector, with consultation responses recognising the benefits of providing greater certainty. Responses also suggested that identifying a specific budget for alternative provision would help in local decisions about how much higher needs and other funding should be earmarked for that purpose. We will develop new approaches to the funding of alternative provision, based on the 3-tier system that prioritises preventative work and reintegration of pupils back into mainstream schools. Funding changes will also need to reflect the role that local partnerships will play in organising alternative provision for an area. And establish a more stable financial system for those delivering this provision. As we test the changes in the planning and delivery of alternative provision through the Change programme, we will make sure that they are supported by appropriate funding reforms. Before implementing funding changes nationally, we will carefully consult with those who provide alternative provision, with mainstream schools that should benefit from their services, and importantly, with local authorities. Local authorities will remain legally responsible for arranging suitable education for those without a school place. Post-16 funding. We are very conscious of the distinct funding issues for colleges and the further education sector. And the many calls on the 16 to 19 disadvantaged funding that is partly allocated to support students with SEND and other additional needs. We have heard a great deal about the challenges across the sector, including the variable approaches to commissioning and funding that colleges experience from the local authorities that they deal with. And in some cases, the sheer number of authorities that they have to engage with. We know that reform is needed, and we will continue to work with the college sector and local authorities as we consider any changes for the future that may be needed. In addition to the introduction of the national standards and funding bands and tariffs. Early years funding. In early years, local authorities are required to establish a Special Educational Needs Inclusion Fund, or SEN-IF. To to provide additional top-up funding to providers to improve outcomes for children with SEND. Funding for the SEN-IF can come from both the early years and high needs funding blocks of the DSG. We are very aware that the early years sector is facing economic challenges, similar to challenges being faced across the economy. Making it more important than ever that the early years funding system is effectively supporting children with SEND. We will work with local authorities, early years providers and stakeholders to consider whether changes to the SEN-IF and other associated elements of the wider current early years funding system are needed. To ensure early years SEND funding arrangements are appropriate and well targeted to both improve outcomes for all preschool children with SEND and to support the introduction of a national framework for bands and tariffs. Management of independent special schools. State-funded independent schools. The Green Paper proposed that national bans and tariffs would apply across the whole range of special education provision. Including the independent specialist sector. Independent special schools represent a third of special schools and support 5% of pupils with EHCPs. The sector's funding comes overwhelmingly from the state. For example, in 2022, local authorities placed over 20,000 children and young people with EHCPs in independent special schools. Despite this, the sector is not treated in the same way as state-maintained specialist provision. Its regulation is designed for private fee-paying schools. Management is fragmented and small-scale, based on local authorities' individual pupil placements. This is inefficient for both commissioners and providers and makes it difficult to assess the overall impact of independent special schools. Provision can be opened or closed regardless of the effect on the existing local offer of provision made by schools and colleges. Leaving local authorities to deal with over or under supply. We will re-examine the state's relationship with independent special schools to ensure the expectations we set are comparable to those on other state-funded specialist providers. We will work with the sector to consider how they should be aligned with the new national standards. Defining the provision they offer and bringing consistency and transparency to their costs. This will mean that independent specialist providers should be part of local authorities' strategic planning. and that decisions about changes to the supply of their provision should be made through local inclusion partnerships. A number of respondents to the consultation were concerned by the risks of trying to standardise highly specialised provision. We do not wish to prevent bespoke packages of support being offered for children and young people with the most complex needs. However, there should be clarity and transparency about the provision available, including at highly specialised schools and colleges. So that children and young people who need such provision can access it quickly, and to ensure that costs are reasonable. Our work with commissioners and providers to understand the provision offered and its costs will therefore ensure that we do prioritise such provision for those with the most complex needs. Residential placements for children and young people with complex needs. In October 2022, the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel published its Phase 1 findings into safeguarding children with disabilities and complex health needs in residential settings. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or IICSA, has also raised issues such as children's voices not being heard. The different regulatory standards for residential special schools and children's homes, and the failure of existing checks and balances. This builds on concerns raised by Dame Christine Lenehan in her 2017 reports into children's homes and residential special schools. The evidence submitted to the Independent Review of Children's Social Care also highlighted that placements for children and young people with complex needs, often autism, learning disabilities, and mental health needs, which can include behaviour which challenges, are often poorly planned and unavailable locally when needed. This results in children and young people being placed far from home, sometimes in placements which are not ideally matched to their needs. A consistent theme has been that children and young people with complex needs who are placed far away from home are more vulnerable. These reports also highlight that disabled children who have difficulty in communicating are at increased risk of abuse. It is vital that we look at what more can be done for those children and those who are outside their local area. A significant proportion of the children and young people in residential special schools are placed there because of challenging behaviour. Residential provision may be the right way to meet the needs of some children and young people, but it places them at greater risk by removing them from their families and local support networks. The proposals set out in this improvement plan to increase the capacity of mainstream schools to meet a wider range of needs have a key role to play. Supported by a proactive alternative provision outreach programme. This is coupled with the increased focus from children's social care on family help, providing support for parents and carers and access to services such as short breaks in the child's own community. As recommended in the independent review of children's social care, as well as the Department of Health and Social Care led Building the Right Support programme. Which seeks to avoid the need for inpatient mental health provision by making specialist and attentive support services available where children are. These reforms seek to meet need at the earliest stage, avoid escalation to crisis situations, and enable children and young people to remain in their families and communities. The Children's Social Care Implementation Strategy seeks to transform the way care is provided to children and young people, prioritising children's living relationships in a home which best meets their needs. It sets out reforms at national, regional and local level to increase sufficiency, improve standards of care and regulations, and move towards a regional model for providing homes for children. This will have an impact on residential special schools, including dual-registered 52-week residential special schools. These reforms include 1. Reviewing the existing legislation and regulation for all forms of care for looked after children and young people. 2. And developing a core overarching set of standards. 2. Working with Ofsted and the sector to develop plans for a financial oversight regime. 3. To increase transparency and prevent sudden market exit which would disrupt the lives of children living there. 3. Supporting local authorities with forecasting, procurement and market shaping, and establishing regional care cooperative or RCC pathfinders in 2 areas. Which will plan, deliver and commission homes for children in care across the region. 4. Improving the sufficiency of residential care provision through capital investment. We will work alongside the Children's Social Care Implementation Strategy's RCC Pathfinders to explore how they can best commission and manage residential provision for children and young people with the most complex needs. And how they should work alongside local inclusion partnerships. Our commitment to both set up an expert working group to review all existing legislation and regulation and develop a core overarching set of standards for all forms of care placements and move to a regional model of care commissioning. We'll also contribute to a more consistent and better quality care placements for both looked after children and those with complex learning or disability needs. In taking forward our reforms following the SEND and Alternative Provision Green Paper, the independent review of children's social care, and the Safeguarding Children with Disabilities and Complex Needs in Residential Settings report. We have an opportunity to set out a new strategy for children and young people with the most complex needs, particularly challenging behaviour. Building on existing programmes of activity in SEND, children's social care and the NHS. The Department for Education is considering how to respond to these system-wide issues. Conclusion. This improvement plan sets out how we will work alongside children, young people and their families, and those who work across every part of the SEND and alternative provision system to deliver improvements for every child and young person with SEND and in alternative provision. As we have demonstrated throughout this plan, there is work underway now to address the immediate challenges facing the system. We know as well that there are many areas of the country where there is excellent practice, and children and young people are receiving the support that they need to succeed. We look forward to continuing to work with you to spread this practice, as well as testing our longer term proposals for systemic reform. So that we can all play our part in supporting children and young people with SEND and in alternative provision.